Over the past 2 or 3 years, I have come to think that we as analysts, particularly those analysts who are interested in Jungian ideas, may neglect the body. To be more specific, whilst our interest is naturally primarily in the psyche, we may, I think, overvalue and idealise the mind and what might be called thinking, and undervalue both the body and, in particular, the contribution of body language. Alternative therapies such as psychodrama, gestalt therapy and bioenergetics have acquired permission to focus on the body and encourage a greater freedom of bodily expression. The Cartesian split between mind and body, which still exists to a great degree, has probably had a detrimental effect on the whole field of mental health, not just on analysis. Conventional scientific medicine may be said to have fostered a split between the objective body and the body of subjective experience. I'm sure that we can all think of occasions when a doctor has failed to pay attention to how we feel about our body, that is, the representation of our body in our mind. As early as 1796, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in a letter to Charles Lloyd Sr., said, and I quote, "I know a great many physicians. They are shallow animals. Having always employed their minds about body and gut, they imagine that in the whole system of things there is nothing but gut and body." End of quote. My struggles to write the initial draft of this paper coincided with a recent holiday when I enjoyed reading a book by the now famous Oliver Sacks called A Leg to Stand On. As some of you may recall, Dr. Sacks is an English neurologist who suffered a serious injury to his left leg whilst on a walking trip in Norway. In the book, he writes most vividly and thoughtfully about his experiences of alienation from his leg and its connection to the rest of his body and his sense of himself. His own treatment as a patient, where his doctors failed to tune in to his feeling that his sense of self had been violated, allowed him, both personally and in his work, to see how actual neurological damage can be accompanied by a profound existential crisis. Jung in 1916 said, quote, "There are those who neither see nor hear anything inside themselves, but whose hands have the knack of giving expression to the contents of the unconscious." End of quote. I have become particularly interested in patients who come to analysis showing deep levels of disturbance via their body, and who by and large are unable to symbolize. How can we find ways of working with people who cannot easily use words, do not bring many dreams, but use their body in particular ways to communicate to the analyst essential information in the service of the less developed part of him or herself? This paper is about my attempts to think about different forms of psychosomatic disturbance and their relations with the self. I have become increasingly dissatisfied with the restrictive way in which many analysts and psychosomaticists use the term psychosomatic, which fails to take account of the full range of such phenomena observable in the consulting room. I'm grateful to several of my patients who helped the seeds of these ideas to germinate, but in particular to one patient, whom I shall call Peter. His prime method of communication to me, at the beginning of his analysis, was with his body, rather than through words. Working with him has at times been both difficult and challenging, never boring. Peter has forced me to look out at him, to observe him and understand the meanings and nuances of his bodily communications, before it has been possible gradually to look inside with him at his inner world. He started analysis with what I shall call body talk, which has only gradually developed into what might be called body language. I shall illustrate what I mean by these two terms later on. I'd like to say a little bit about the body in the consulting room. Analysts do, of course, pay attention to the body. There are two bodies in the consulting room. My patients talk about their body, and indeed about my body as their analyst. My patients have visible physical reactions to what is happening within the transference, and I am at times aware of sensations in my body which are valuable clues about the effect of the patient on me and about what is going on in the transference. So all patients talk with their bodies when they come to see us, and the body may be seen to have a language of its own, which is asking to be decoded and understood. Joyce McDougall writes in her book Theatres of the Body, quote, "The body's language has many dialects. Each patient, using the soma's complex translation of the psyche's message, reveals a different drama." End of quote. I find it helpful to think about three different, though overlapping, levels of bodily communications from patients. They may be conscious, but are usually unconscious. There are firstly the gestures, movements, way of speaking, clothes, and so on, of a patient which are to do with his or her characteristic way of being. They become my sense impressions of my patient's persona and general self-image. A 40-year-old woman who often wears short socks and baggy jackets, who can look small in big clothes or big in small clothes. A man who always yawns at the beginning of each session before he speaks. Another man who rhythmically taps his left foot onto his right foot and strokes his chin throughout the session. Secondly, though not unrelated, there is body language which is about the here and now of the session and the transference. A sudden blush, a cough, a stomach rumble, and on occasion the patient who walks out in the middle of the session. These are live happenings in the room and betray areas of feeling or anxiety which reflect the nuances of the analytic relationship. Finally, there are patients who bring actual somatic illness into the consulting room. One patient I saw has suffered for a long time from psoriasis, which no one, including me, should see. She feared that I would find her ugly and physically repulsive if I were to see her skin. Another woman used to go through periods of intense preoccupation with her bowels, and when in a group with other people, became so terrified of losing control that she needed always to remain near to a lavatory. She described her body as her enemy.
Anthony, what's
The third patient had several bouts of illness, including 2 severe respiratory tract infections, during a short and largely unsuccessful analysis. For these latter patients, the illness, or somatic explosion, does, I think, protect them from archetypal experiences which feel life-threatening, and where the subjective experience of their body at that time is one of not-self. Now something about psyche, soma, and the self. I would like to return to the issue which centrally preoccupies me, the relationship between psychosomatic illness and the self. Today, there is a growing interest in psychosomatic medicine, the relationship between the body and the mind, and the psychic meaning which particular symptoms or body-based experiences may have for our patients. Here we are concerned with the nature and texture of the self. In her paper, Body Language and the Self, The Search for Psychic Truth, Judith Hubbock aptly points out, quote, "While we are still alive, we can only know and do anything at all by means of the self, that mysterious factor that holds matter and spirit together, links them, and enables them to relate. We are neither disembodied psyches nor mindless bodies." End of quote. What has come to interest me is why the self may fail to hold matter and spirit, or body and mind, together for some patients, and why it is that some patients may develop psychosomatic rather than other sorts of symptoms. Whilst the debate continues as to whether we should use a big or a small s for the self, it seems to me that there is now agreement amongst Jungians as to what we mean by the self. As Kenneth Lambert says, "The self is a theoretical entity used to encompass the idea of the personality as a whole in all its aspects. It is a psychosomatic unity, composed of consciousness and unconsciousness, both personal and collective. It is an entity in which the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, in which a series of opposites can come together and form a completely new synthesis." End of quote. Whilst it may be relatively safe to assume that we have a shared meaning when we use the term self, there is much less clarity around what we mean by the concept psychosomatic. The formal study of psychosomatic medicine began in the 1930s, and there is now a comprehensive research and analytical literature. Though some psychoanalysts have written extensively on the subject, Joyce McDougall and Graham Taylor, for example, Jungian interest has up to now been limited. Although sometimes used as a description of an early body-mind unity, the word psychosomatic has traditionally been used in a specific way to imply actual bodily illness. As McDougall says, and I quote, "I have come to consider as related to psychosomatic phenomena all cases of physical damage or ill health in which psychological factors play an important role. In psychosomatic states, the body appears to be behaving in a delusional fashion, often over-functioning excessively to a degree that appears physiologically senseless. One is tempted to say that the body has gone mad." End of quote. Whilst the phenomena she talks of can be extended to include insomnia, migraine, accident proneness, and addictions, traditionally they have involved what have been called Alexander's Holy Seven, or the Chicago Seven: ulcerative colitis, bronchial asthma, skin allergies, thyroid gland disease, rheumatoid arthritis, gastric ulcers, and high blood pressure that has no physical determinant. As you have probably gathered, I would like to extend and modify the way in which we as analysts use the term psychosomatic. More particularly, as I would like to illustrate with reference to my patient Peter, it seems to me that there are particular forms of bodily communication, or body talk, that need not take the form of a specific illness, as with the Chicago Seven, but do suggest an early, undifferentiated state, where there is as yet no internal space for a mind, and therefore for thinking to develop. Originally, I found myself wanting to use the term psychogenic to describe such patients, but on reflection, this term, which conveys a disturbance in the body which has a psychological rather than an organic base, is merely descriptive and fails to convey the full meaning of their presenting problems. I'd like now to say something about my patient. Peter is 32 and has been in 4 times a week analysis for about 4.5 years. At the beginning of his analysis, he used his body in the analytic sessions to tell a story about himself, but in such a way that any kind of intercourse or conjunctio was generally avoided. He brings somatic disturbance which is, I think, initiated by the psyche, although with the exception of memories of childhood migraine, he brings no classical psychosomatic illness or symptoms. Significantly, his professional work, which demands a capacity for image making and mental representation, causes him much torment. He took longer than most of his contemporaries to qualify, and feels much more comfortable in himself doing physical work than using his hands. He came into analysis complaining about confusion around sex and his body, which was severely inhibiting his capacity, as he saw it, to sustain a lasting relationship with a woman. He has had a series of sexual relationships, initially idealized but quickly disappointing. He would often tell me that his head felt thick, wooden, or like concrete, and not connected with his body, or that he felt dirty about his body. In trying to give you a flavour of Peter's analysis, it is important to tell you that from the beginning, with my encouragement, he has used the couch. He communicated primarily via his movements, his actions, and his sounds, and initially could not easily put into words his thoughts and feelings, let alone reflect with me about them. On the couch he was rarely still for a minute. He would sit up holding a cushion over his face one moment, to hide himself from me. Then the next moment he would be kneeling with his head in the cushions and his bottom up in the air with his shirt hanging out, so I could see the top of his underpants and most of his bare back. He would writhe around, stretching, kicking and squirming in the most labile way. In the first few months he would occasionally stand for 10 minutes at the door talking to me before he came onto the couch. Other days he would lie on his back with his legs high in the air, and at times he chose to lie with his feet on the cushions and his head towards the bottom of the couch, looking at me. Sometimes, even now, he takes the rug and puts it right over his head. It can take me several minutes to get the room back into some kind of order after he leaves. He is a very attractive, boyish-looking man who dresses like an adolescent. He has a range of T-shirts with different, loud, often political slogans on the chest. His trousers sometimes have large, provocative holes, and he frequently wears odd socks. In the winter he has taken to wearing woolly hats, which make him look rather girlish. And for periods of his analysis, he has come to his sessions on a motorbike, which then involves elaborate undressing and dressing rituals in front of me. He could be very noisy, If he did not like something I had said, he would shout "no" or "stop it" or "naughty." But he frequently interrupted my, or more commonly his own communications with a shriek of "ah" or "ah." Can't imitate him very well. In another phase of the analysis, he occasionally howled like an animal in pain for several minutes. Later, he at times went into some kind of autoerotic state, where he curled up with his fingers in his mouth, interspersing sort of gug and coo noises with a kind of whispered babble or baby fantasy talk, which was both difficult to hear and to understand. This primitive body talk, or proto-language, as Joyce McDougall might call it, can be seen as a form of acting in, as it happens within the consulting room. Peter also acts out. He is frequently late for sessions, and sometimes misses altogether, usually because he has overslept. Quite early on in the analysis, he had an affair with a much older woman. On one occasion, I could not help but feel amused when I went downstairs after he had left a session to find that he had distributed leaflets advertising Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday celebrations all over the hall and outside on my car. He can be extremely seductive. His histrionic antics and the way he uses his body would bombard my senses. I was often left feeling disoriented and disconnected, as if I had temporarily lost my sense of myself, and certainly my ability to reflect upon what was happening between us. I could not transform my own sense and affect into less crude reflections and thoughts. I was taken up with his movements, his appearance, his noise, and found myself unable to attend to the meaning which might lie behind them. It is as if his body talk was a substitute for thinking and emotionally experiencing, and I became caught up in this dynamic. Just as he forces me to attend to his body, he is both curious and watchful of mine. If I move or cough, he is immediately anxious that I am ill or not fully attending to his needs. He often comments on my clothes as to whether I look well, tired, thinner, fatter, and so on. He comes early in the morning and worries that I am not ready to see him. At the beginning of most sessions now, he will first sit cross-legged on the couch, facing me, and look at me. At times I experience this as a plea for help. He wants me to say something, to let him know that I am there. At other times, his looking has a flirtatious, playful quality, as if he wants to awaken, arouse, or tantalize me. Sometimes his eyes seem to be looking into me invasively, as if he must know what goes on inside my mind, what I am thinking or feeling. He tells me that he hates the ends of sessions, and that he always feels hungry and unsatisfied when he leaves, but that he quickly forgets about me as the day progresses. Finding a language with which to talk to Peter is a problem. How can I speak to that which does not use words? If my sentences are too long or complicated, he will say, "Don't go so fast," or "It's too much for me." At other times, if I try to make an interpretation, he snaps, "I can't hear you," or "I'm not listening." Many interpretations were simply not understood, as if he had as yet no emotional digestive system, but also as if he needed to keep me at bay, to avoid any real intercourse between us. If I used body words, which might include breast or penis, he would get so excited that the talk and the analytic setting were in danger of becoming excessively sexualized in an unhelpful way. Over time, Peter's body talk or action symptoms have diminished, and the sessions feel more real. He is now less physical and more able to talk and reflect. I, in turn, am less frequently irritated or stunned by him, and find myself more able to think during sessions. For a long time in the early part of Peter's analysis, I think I was caught up in an unhelpful participation mystique, where I was struggling to understand and talk to him about the minutiae of his body talk in terms of infantile wishes which he wanted me to gratify, rather than as an expression of a basic narcissistic deprivation. The difficulties had to be lived out in the transference before they could be understood. In thinking about how Peter's body talk is evolving into body language, and the possibility of a conversation between us, which also involves words, I have found that if I am more direct and spontaneous, and take up the form of the session rather than the content, by trying to put into words what I think he is doing and what is going on between us in the here and now of the transference, then this seems to help him to think about himself and experience some of the areas of real pain which he is defending himself against. His need to get me to react rather than respond is a prerequisite for symbolic communication. I think that's important. Let me give you one or two recent examples. Peter came in one morning telling me that he felt all glued together and that he needed lots of help from me. I felt myself leaning towards him, as if in response to his wish for help. I was thinking that unusually he seemed to be thinking about himself and aware in the all glued together of his fragile sense of self. However, as I was about to say something, I caught him looking at me sneakily, rather like an excited little boy wanting to look up mother's skirts. I suddenly felt very angry and spontaneously said very sharply, "Peter, this is not a game." He sulked silently for a while, and I felt cross with myself for what I felt had been a countertransference acting out. I had persecuted my patient. Eventually, he told me that he felt told off, which I suppose was true, and then confessed that he found it exciting to look at me when he thought I could not see him. Most unusually, he came the next day with a dream. He was outside a window, walking along a ledge. When he looked inside, he saw his sister in bed with her boyfriend. He saw the boyfriend drag his sister toward the window in order that Peter might have a good view up his sister's skirt between her legs. My annoyance, which I did not and could not hide from him, seemed to have functioned as a helpful boundary or action of containment, in which something, his voyeurism, could then be symbolized in a dream. Significantly, his dream followed my action, and I have come to think of this as his need for a third, the father, to come in and put a stop to the over-sexualized play with mother. At times now, if he has digested something I have said, he begins to sob uncontrollably. One day recently, when he was telling me again how hungry he felt, I found myself having a fantasy about him feeding from me. This fantasy gave me a strong physical sensation in my breasts and brought tears to my eyes. When I could think about what had happened between us after the session was over, it was as though for the first time there had been some real intersubjective contact, and my experience in my body suggested that he, at least for a moment, was in touch with his infant dependent self, which could accept something from me. I'd like to use the rest of the time available to discuss the different ways in which I have come to think about Peter's use of his body, and to try and pinpoint what it is in our work together that has helped him to begin to develop a mind and some emerging capacity for self-reflection. In particular, I would like to explore and compare what psychoanalysis and analytical psychology have to offer in the study of patients who reveal a split between their bodily self and their emotional self. I suppose there's first of all the question of would we think about Peter as a hysteric? It was, of course, Freud who said that the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. And it was the hysterical body that led to the birth of our profession. Freud believed that when a hysterical patient did not know something, he or she actually did not want to know. This he attributed to repressed fantasies of early sexual seduction, which found somatic rather than psychic expression. Thinking about the hysterical components of Peter's presentation has been very helpful to me technically. As Bolas remarks, quote, "Few patients enjoy the possession of an analyst quite like the hysteric. Such people seem almost wholly concerned to grip the analyst in order to create an unforgettable vision, and such an aim takes precedence over thinking, reflecting, and understanding." End of quote. He believes that hysterical conversion still exists, but that it is now often the analyst who suffers the effects of the hysterical conversion through general paralysis, rather than its appearance more directly as a bodily symptom in the patient. Masud Khan believes that the illness finds character and shape in adolescence, and that, and I quote, The hysteric in early childhood deals with the failures of good enough mothering and care by precocious sexual development, in lieu of affective relating and ego functions." End of quote. Sexual relationships are craved, but leave the patient in a perpetual state of grudge, as Masad Khan says, because they do not actually nurture him. Hysteria, he thinks, is not so much an illness as a technique of staying blank and absent from oneself, with symptoms as a substitute to screen this absence. Peter's hysterical, or I suppose what we might see as exhibitionistic behaviour, is both a communication and a defence. His body talk is meaningful in that it is his way of letting me know about his more primitive needs and indeed about his deprivations. But it is also an act, an attempt to ensure that I do not get to know him, so that there is no mutuality in relating. On the one hand, he uses his eyes, voice and movements in order to communicate his affects to me. On the other hand, he uses his eyes, voice and movements to get inside me, as if he wants to excite, control or possess me, and certainly to stop me thinking about him. His complaints that he feels wooden or like concrete are his ways of staying absent from himself. It was only when I realised this and began to think about his behaviour as adolescent, and myself as father rather than mother, that I could more confidently take up the defensive aspects of his body talk and his wish to sexualise the analysis as a substitute for letting me really get to know and help him. It was only then that his body talk diminished and he seemed to feel more contained. And now the question of whether we can think about Peter as a psychosomatic patient. Although Peter does not produce the gastric, respiratory or allergic somatic explosions typical of psychosomatic illness, I do think of his presentation as essentially psychosomatic rather than psychogenic. Whilst ideas about hysteria have helped me technically in the day-to-day transference work, it is here that I have been most helped in my thinking about his underlying difficulties that clearly began in early life. McDougall maintains that, and I quote, "certain allergic, gastric, cardiac and other reactions may be a somatic expression of an attempt to protect oneself against truly archaic, libidinal and narcissistic longings that are felt to be life-endangering, much as a small infant might experience the threat of death." End of quote. When this happens, she believes that the psyche warns the body of danger and bypasses the use of language, so that whatever is threatening cannot be thought about, and so is somatized. These profound splits between psyche and soma occurs when, and I quote, "separation and difference are feared as experiences that may destroy the sense of self." End of quote. She believes they arise out of failures in the relationship between mother and infant, where the infant's fantasies about and wishes for fusion, that is, an illusion of oneness, are so frightening that they must be defended against, and the infant then fails to internalise a maternal object with what she calls caretaking functions. It seems to me that Peter enacts his difficulties and his deprivations within the transference. He somatises by using his body as a way of dispersing in action any emotional experience which could be psychically meaningful, presumably because it feels too frightening or threatening to his psychic survival. I speculate from my own experiences with him in the consulting room that Peter's emotional relationship with his mother in infancy may have involved affects which were too exciting or powerful to manage. In the transference, I am forced to identify with his internal mother, who could not think about him or would blank out or become confused, as I often did. And now a contribution from analytical psychology. Although analytical psychology has not as yet paid a great deal of serious attention to the study of body language, or indeed to psychosomatic phenomena, Jungian ideas seem to me to be fertile ground for development. Jung himself, in his theory of archetypes, clearly thought that psyche and soma were ultimately united. No Cartesian split for him. The archetypes are bipolar in that they have two aspects, but the two are definitely related. His concept of the psychoid, although never really fully developed, referred to a level of the unconscious which is completely inaccessible to consciousness, but seems to me to point to the idea of an early psychosomatic unity. Andrew Samuels defines the psychoid unconscious as the most fundamental level of the unconscious, which has properties in common with the organic world. The psychological and the physiological worlds may be seen as two sides of a single coin. The psychoid level is neutral in character, being neither wholly psychological nor wholly physiological." End of quote. I suppose the word association test devised by Jung to measure response times to particular stimulus words could be said to be a very early experimental attempt to look at the relationship between body reactions and areas of psychological anxiety for the individual. These revealed what Jung called the complexes, or feeling-toned complexes in his patients, which could be directly linked with unconscious emotional areas of problem. Contemporary Jungians have developed these ideas in two different ways. Firstly, there are those authors who focus on self-psychology and the relationship between areas of the personality which are experienced as self and those which are experienced as not self. Secondly, there are those authors who have more of an object relations orientation, who look at the dynamic process of how the self gradually emerges within the mother-child relationship, and I suppose how mind develops out of body. Joe Redfern falls into the first category. He has developed the idea of subpersonalities as dynamic units of the personality. They are analogous to the internal objects and the mental structures of psychoanalysis. He talks about the I and the not I parts of the self, and how at times, through the migration of the I, as he calls it, bodily symptoms may develop as a subpersonality. Redfern believes that unconsciously, what the somatic body is doing to the individual may be linked to what his internal mother did to him. Similarly, the Jungian analyst Leopold Stein, in a rather neglected paper which did, I think, influence Fordham, uses his knowledge about biology, in particular immunology, to show that the individual's ability to, quote, recognise its own self and to distinguish it from not self is basic and essential. End of quote. He shows, by linking Fordham's ideas about the self with biochemical and biological analogies, how, and there's another quote here, the psychosomatic self can apprehend its own constituents in the wrong sense, and then defend itself against part of itself as if it were not self. End of quote. Anything that is experienced as not self is therefore treated as essentially hostile and attacked. He points out that the Latin word defendere actually means to beat back, implying in our language a defence of the self. My patient, who perceived her body to be her enemy and feared losing control of her bowels, tried to defend herself against the body she feared would let her down. That part of her body was essentially not self. Going back to Oliver Sacks, after his accident, it could be said that the neurological damage to his leg triggered a defence of the self against what was experienced as not self. And I quote from Oliver Sacks, "The more I gazed at that cylinder of chalk, which was his plaster cast, the more alien and incomprehensible it appeared to me. I could no longer feel it as mine, as part of me. It seemed to bear no relation whatever to me. It was absolutely not me, and yet, impossibly, it was attached to me, and even more impossibly, continuous with me." End of quote. Peter might be said to be relating to his body as if it were not self, via a hysterical defence. He tries to play with me, and gets excited by me as his analyst mother, but he cannot really take from me, because the experience of the nourishing mother is of not self, and must therefore be warded off. Another way of putting this would be to say that Peter has internalized an impermeable mother, who cannot love or understand him. In the analysis, this internal mother is repeatedly projected into me, so that psychic growth and the development of an internal container in which he can differentiate between bodily impulses and thoughts has been inhibited. I do not know if any of you have patients like Peter, but his style of presentation would, I'm sure, sound familiar to many child analysts. McDougall links the importance of the infant's self-feeling with the quality of the earliest relationship between mother and baby, and today Infant observation studies permit us to watch and think about how a baby uses his or her body and may deal with distress through somatic expression. As Miranda Davies pointed out in her paper The Body in Child Analysis, and I quote, "We are often dealing with play, elaborating fantasies that stem from the period of infant development when fantasy and body sensations and functions are experienced as the same thing." End of quote. We are here in the area of the development of the self, how a sense of self emerges, and thus how mind develops out of body. Michael Fordham's work on the evolution and development of the self bring us to the second, sort of what I have described as more object-related area, where Jungian theory has something to offer in thinking about Peter and the hold-ups in his development. Fordham calls the early self the primary self, and sees the infant from the beginning as a person separate from the mother. He would not agree with Joyce McDougall that psychic life commences with an experience of merging and a fantasy of one body and mind for two people. Fordham does, however, think of the infant as a, and I quote, unity, a self, out of which psychic structures develop as part of physical ones. Quite small infants show the rudiments of mental activity that seems at all points united with bodily states and very dynamic activities. End of quote. Fordham is saying that in infancy they are indistinguishable, but that as the baby develops, a process of what he calls de-integration begins, whereby the primary self loosens into archetypal forms to allow for new experiences which may then be reintegrated. One of the earliest might be said to be the infant's expectation of the mother who feeds. Fordham thinks that a deintegrate is psychosomatic, in the sense that an infant cannot distinguish mental representations from bodily experience, but that gradually, as the reintegrative process continues and repeats itself, and if the meeting between the archetypal expectation of a mother and the actual mother is satisfactory, then the self will change and begin to contain internal representations based on actual experience, as well as archetypal potentialities. This is the beginning of symbol formation and ego development, and the infant learns to differentiate self from not self. If, however, the meeting between expectation and object is not satisfactory, then the infant becomes distressed and consequently tries to defend against the distress, and ego development is impaired. At times, the fear, rage, and so on are so great that the infant erects what Fordham has called defences of the self, which protect him from disintegration, but which can at the same time hinder the development of the capacity for mental representation necessary for language and symbolization. Peter's exhibitionism forces me to pay attention to his body. Over time, when I have become more able to digest his powerful communications and affects, I have come to see that the histrionics are a defence against a previous attack on his underdeveloped or damaged sense of self, when reintegration experiences were not yet strong enough. I'd now like to, sort of getting to the end, say something about psychosomatic symptoms in what I think about particularly as disturbance in vitality affects. I don't know if any of you have read Daniel Stern, but that's say a little bit about that. I would like to return to the complex question of why some patients, such as Peter, develop psychosomatic rather than other symptoms. Louis Zinkin's seminal paper, The Klein Connection in the London School, The Search for Origins, does go some way towards developing our understanding. Following the work of Daniel Stern, he emphasises the point that it is the manner in which interpretations are made which can be as important as the verbal components themselves. He makes a distinction between what may be called category affects, such as anger, sadness, joy, fear, disgust, and so on, and what he calls, well, in fact, what Stern called vitality affects, which cannot be classified in terms of these readily recognisable emotions, as they do not have names. Zinkin describes them in terms of their kinetic qualities, such as surging, exploding, fading away, accelerating. The vitality affect is, as Zinkin says, the patient's particular form of being alive. which he likens to the musical signs like crescendo, allegro ma non troppo, and so on, rather than the actual notes to be played. The mother, in trying to tune into her baby, and I quote, gives meaning to what the baby expresses, and is concerned at the same time with the regulation of affects and levels of arousal, and the transition between them, as well as the satisfaction of basic bodily needs. End of quote. I might speculate from my own countertransference affects that Peter's mother found it difficult to tune in to the vitality affects of her baby, which led him to develop a sforzando, which is kind of forcing, or sfoggiando, which is flaunting or ostentatious, approach in an attempt to attract my attention. His effect on me reminds me particularly of the primitive rhythms in Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. From this, I would like to put forward the hypothesis that many psychosomatic patients may be suffering from particular disturbances in vitality affects, emanating from the time when sensuous communications between mother and baby can critically affect emotional development. For the baby, the mother's face, her voice, her skin, and her smell are, in my opinion, as important as the breast and experiences connected with sucking. Although other authors do not necessarily choose to use the term vitality affects, there is now a growing body of evidence in the literature to support this view. Joyce McDougall's case illustrations of psychosomatic patients show, and I quote, the effects in adulthood of a pre-verbal child's early perception of affectless modes of functioning as a way of combating psychological pain, early frustration and panic. End of quote. Didier Anzieux, in his book The Skin Ego, puts it beautifully, and again I quote, the infant experiences the maternal gestures first as a sensory stimulus, then as a communication. The massage becomes a message. End of quote. Taylor, that's Graham Taylor, in his comprehensive review of psychosomatic medicine and contemporary psychoanalysis, encourages us to view psychosomatic illness as a disorder of psychobiological regulation. He states that, quote, a person's physical health depends on his ability to regulate complex physiological and biochemical processes in order to maintain homeostatic equilibrium. These vulnerable people, psychosomatic patients that is, may be especially sensitive to changes in their interpersonal relationships. End of quote. He, like Zinkin, emphasizes the significance of the mother in providing certain regulatory functions to encourage her infant in the developmental process towards self-regulation. Finally, I read in a recent copy of The Independent, I think it was last month, about some research by Dr. Jacques Mehler in Paris. By measuring the vigour of babies' sucking reflexes, he discovers that French babies can tell the difference between spoken French and Russian, but take a little longer to distinguish English. His research seems to support Chomsky's long-held belief that infants are born with an innate, or in our language, archetypal capacity to understand the rules of grammar. But of greater relevance to our immediate area of concern was the discovery that babies respond primarily to the melody, or what he calls the prosody, which means line and rhythm, of the language, rather than the individual sounds. So, in conclusion, in this paper, I am making a plea to reconsider and extend the meaning which we give to the term psychosomatic, so that it may include patients who come for therapy or analysis with often severe anxieties about their bodies, but which may not necessarily take the form of an actual organic bodily illness. In suggesting this, I am also making a distinction between what I have called body talk and body language. Body talk I see as a primitive mode of communication, or babble, which is a precursor to talking, and which comes to be a substitute for talking, thinking, and reflecting. It suggests a fundamental split between body and mind. However, the talk contains within it the meaning of the problem. I hypothesize that it is a consequence of the kind of pre-verbal communication between mother and baby where there may have been a bad fit in terms of vitality affects. In later life, this can manifest itself in the form of body or psychosomatic problems which cannot be put into words. People may come into analysis with specific bodily symptoms which are troubling them, Or more generally, the transference may reveal that patients experience parts of their body, its activities, or even their whole body, as essentially foreign or not self. Body language is complementary to, rather than a substitute for talking, thinking, and reflecting. It is an essential and unique component in every patient's communication about himself, and we learn much through observing with our eyes, our nose, as well as through our ears. Whilst we may all regress into body talk when under stress, body language is somehow more developed, less primitive. In the countertransference, there is, in my experience, less evidence of the kind of dissonance or discomfort between what a patient is saying and what they are conveying with their body, which I feel when in the presence of body talk. Joyce McDougall quotes Henry Maudsley, London's famous 19th century anatomist. "The sorrow that has no vent in tears makes other organs weep." Patients such as Peter are weeping or perhaps raging with their body about very early disturbance which cannot as yet be put into words, thought about, or dreamed about. He came into analysis stuck in an overexcited, sexualized relationship with his mother, which was repeated with every new woman he met, and inevitably in the analysis with me. It was only by first living out and experiencing this relationship that I could then take up the defensive aspects of his body talk. Through this, he is developing some capacity for reflecting about himself, which in turn is leading to more real body language and the beginnings of a mind, a psychosomatic unity in the positive sense of the word. Working with such patients in analysis is dependent on the analyst's capacity to fully metabolize his or her own countertransference affects prior to responding. I wasn't always very good at it. Projective identification is one way of naming this earliest mode of defense and communication, which needs to be felt and understood by the analyst, often in a bodily way. A classical Jungian would think about it as a requirement for participation mystique, where the analyst and patient may have to tolerate at times during the course of an analysis, when they will inevitably become unconsciously enmeshed. That is, they will have to live the transference in order to understand it. As no doubt you will appreciate that the title of my paper, Looking Out and Looking In, was intended to convey the need to attend to bodily communications, as well as the dangers of being taken in by them. One Saturday, when I had almost finished this paper, I went to a local second-hand book sale and came home with a very old copy of early T.S. Eliot poems. Remarkably, the book fell open at a piece of prose called Hysteria. It seems to illuminate so clearly what I have been trying to say that I would like to finish by reading it to you. As she laughed, I was aware of becoming involved in her laughter and being part of it, until her teeth were only accidental stars with a talent for squad drill. I was drawn in by short gasps, inhaled at each momentary recovery, lost finally in the dark caverns of her throat, bruised by the ripple of unseen muscles. An elderly waiter with trembling hands was hurriedly spreading a pink and white checked cloth over the rusty green iron table, saying, "If the lady and gentleman wish to take their tea in the garden, if the lady and gentleman wish to take their tea in the garden." I decided that if the shaking of her breasts could be stopped, some of the fragments of the afternoon might be collected, and I concentrated my attention with careful subtlety to this end.